Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. I'm going to talk about one fiction book and one non-fiction. So the fiction is Dark Eden by Beckett, and the non-fiction is Good Night and Good Riddance, How 35 Years of John Peel Helped Shape Modern Life. So I'm going to start with Dark Eden, holding up long enough hopefully to get a thumbnail of this. This was recommended to me by Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and it is a buddy read with Silje from Norway. So today is Saturday, I'm recording my review. I'll probably upload it tomorrow on Sunday. Silje will talk about it in her Sunday wrap-up. I'm not quite sure when she posts that, but hopefully there won't be too far between the two of us. Okay, so this book was, I can put it down now probably. Dark Eden was by turns thought-provoking and exasperating. It had some very, very interesting themes, but it was written in such a way that it could have, I felt at times I was reading a young adult book. Anyway, let me tell you what it's about, and then maybe I can dig deeper into those. So it's set in a world where it's sort of after 5 humans have sort of either crashed or landed in their spaceship, and I assume crashed because 3 of them sort of get the shuttle and try and go back to Earth. 2 of them refuse to do so. They're called Tommy and Angela, and they sort of effectively are marooned on this planet called Eden. And in a sort of Adam and Eve way, all of the sort of human race on this planet springs from them. So the story opens several generations later when there's about 500 humans who've all descended from Tommy and Angela. And the first thing to say is I think it's absolutely beautiful how Beckett has set up the ecology of this planet. It doesn't have a sun, it doesn't have a star, so there's no natural light. But what it does have is it has trees that sort of get their sustenance from the underground through some sort of volcanic or magma or something that sort of gives them their sort of life and heat. And on these trees grow starflowers which provide light. And some of the animals also have their own sort of like lanterns. So those are the only sources of light. So that in areas of the planet where there's no animal life and no trees, it's completely dark. And I think all of that is brilliantly realised and very imaginative. The problem for me was the human colony that inhabits it. So they have stayed in the same place for the 500 years because they are expecting Earth, the 3 who set off to go back to Earth, to initiate a rescue from Earth. And even though this is, I don't know exactly how many years after, obviously nothing has happened, but they've built up a sort of a faith and a religion and a theology and a set of rituals based on the 2 original founders, the Adam and the Eve, the Angela and the Tommy, that is absolutely predicated on them being rescued and returning to an Earth that none of them ever experienced before. And there's rituals, there's fetishised objects, there's barely remembered or understood things which feed into the language of this book, whereby, secret tree is their understanding of the word secretary, and yet the secret tree person minutes all of their sort of, meetings and stuff. So they sort of have half a grasp on these things that they've never experienced. Where they are is a complete primitive technology. There's no metal. It is very much a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and I felt this is what let the book down really, because as great as the ecology of the planet was imagined and described, I felt this hunter-gatherer stuff was very sort of standard, didn't give any new insights. If I'd sat down, been told to write in an hour, the sketch for a hunter-gatherer primitive society, I would have come up with exactly the same. So I felt that let Beckett down a bit. He was better on the fauna than the flora than the human fauna. Going mad. Okay, so that is the backdrop of this book, but this is where it starts to get much more interesting. As I said, they've stayed rooted in place. They have these fixed rituals and anniversaries and fetishised objects. But one of their number, called John Lantern, who's a teenager, John Red Lantern, who's a teenager, he is a restless spirit. And he believes that, if they stay where they are, the food will run out, the hunting, they'll kill everything off, which of course is happening in our world today. And he's quite keen to explore the rest of the planet and can't believe that they're nowhere You know, they've never moved out of here other than on their hunting trips, and always obviously come back. And he feels it's the spirit of Earth. You know, all the things that they achieved. You know, they know about television and electricity. They don't know what they are, but they've heard about them as these sort of, you know, touchstone words. And, you know, he knows that they only, you know, achieve those things by exploration. So he is very much a sort of a revolutionary radical. And early in the book, he has the good fortune where instead of running from a leopard, which is the most dangerous beast on Eden, he manages to kill it. And so is heralded as a hero and a great warrior. And that gives him a little status and power, which seems to go to his head because he decides he's going to act on his sort of revolutionary ideas. And basically, you know, his behaviour is increasingly intolerable to the community, and he's banished. But he has enough allies amongst some of the younger members of the society that they go with him. They're going to form like an alternative community. But it involves going over a sort of an icy desert called Snowy Dark. No one knows what's on the other side because no one's ever been there. Now, the reason I say it's interesting is because what Beckett is exploring, amongst other things, is this battle of conservatism and traditional belief and ritual versus, you know, revolutionary exploration, experimentation. But more importantly, I think, it's about the concept of hero and storytelling. Because in their years of stasis, of staying in this same place, of having these rituals every year, the same stories of their ancestors, Angela and Tommy, relayed every year, you know, they're absolutely frozen in time and in motion. And John knows by what he's doing, striking out to the unknown, he is forging new stories, and he imagines that, you know, these stories will be told in the future alongside the ones of their founders. But it's also sort of self-aggrandising in that, in his mind, he knows he is a hero in the traditional sense of what a hero means, because the word hero came to us through literature, not language. You know, it is a literary concept in the sense that the ancient Greek heroes were demigods. You know, they looked to stand above the crowd, and because of that sort of fatal inherent flaw, that hubris, they always came crashing back down to earth. And I think this is what Beckett is exploring in a you know, 21st century concept, although he's chosen a part futuristic science fiction, but part ancient sort of primitive culture in which to explore it. So that, you know, John isn't a wholly likeable sort of character, because he's very sure of himself that he will be. He is already a hero. He already stands above the crowd. He is special, which I think is highly dubious, and that he is making new stories. But of course, when you make new stories, they will become fixed and frozen and ritualised and remembered on anniversaries just the same, which cuts against the sort of being revolutionary and radical. I think these are really interesting ideas. The problem is that he's slightly hidebound, Beckett, because we are looking at this through the eyes of children. And children in the sense of, yes, they're teenagers, but also that they're a primitive culture with not a sophisticated language and not a sophisticated analytical apparatus, because a lot of what we take for granted in our understanding of the world has gone from these people because they're on a different planet with different sort of stimuli and experience and prompts and stuff. So as much as it's interesting, it's also slightly ham-fisted, because he's restricted by what the characters could do and say. So, for example, you know, every chapter has a different narrator from the one before. The two main ones are John Redlantern and Tina Spiketree, who's sort of his girlfriend, but sort of not. So John, you know, John, as I say, he's a restless person, always on the move, and that psychology is not really ever explored. In some ways, it's justified and rationalised as him being full of his sense of being special, being revolutionary, and having to forge ahead to new discoveries. But it's never really, you know, the shift, you know, his temperament to always be on the move, never settle, you know, is never really explored. And a lot of the stuff about his sort of, you know, stuff about being a hero stuff is actually relayed to us in the chapters devoted to Tina Spiketree. So again, there's this, you know, the characters are not very fulfilling, I find. They have interesting facets, but those facets are always reported rather than sort of emerge organically. You know, Beckett explains to us this stuff about heroism, and I did find it interesting. But as I say, it was a bit ham-fisted. And that's it really. That's all I want to say, because I think to go on would give spoilers. Basically, you've got John Red Lantern's community, the other side of Snowy Dark. You've got the original community and their attentions, and that sort of forms the second half of the book. And that's all I'm going to say. But that seems to be the jumping off point for books 2 and 3 in the series, even though the next book, book 2, happens I think 500 years after this one. But I have no real interest in reading them, because I'm not interested in one human colony against another human colony. I was interested in the story of heroism and establishing new stories, and the the freezing of those new stories, so that they don't move on and develop anymore either, and that sort of contradiction. So there was a lot to admire in this book, but there was, as I say, a lot to frustrate, because I did find some of the language, not the language, some of the characterisation and the narrative a bit ham-fisted. As I say, at times read like a young adult book, because you were looking through the eyes of young adults. I've posted a review about child narrators in serious literary fiction, and I'll post a link to that. Now, admittedly, these are teenagers, so they are more sophisticated than the ones I talk about in my other video, but it's still a problem. As I say, and they're teenagers, but they're actually sort of younger than that mentally, because of, they come from a primitive culture. I gave this 3.5 to 4 stars. I mean, if I'm being honest, it's 3.5 because of the flaws, but it was of interest enough that in a sort of pure way, not getting ground down on how it was written, I would give it 4. So that is Dark Eden by Chris Beckett. I'm looking forward to seeing what Silje says. Obviously, we had lots of talk during our read of it over Voxer, so I kind of know what she's going to say, but I'm not going to put any words in her mouth. I'll let her speak for herself. And Silje, thank you very much. I really enjoyed our buddy read, and let's do another one sometime. Okay, and on to the non-fiction. John Peel, Good Night and Good Riddance, How 35 Years of John Peel Helped Shape Modern Life by David Cavanagh. This book is the soundtrack to my life, or represents the soundtrack to my life. Because John Peel, I'm going to have to give some backstory here, particularly for American viewers. John Peel was a BBC Radio 1 DJ who was there at the start of the station being set up in 1967 and lasted all the way until his death in 2005, which is an incredible achievement, because every other one of those DJs who started with them in 67 had long since left the station, been forced out. And although Peel had to fight several battles himself, he lasted. He was the only one never forced out by all the various rebrands and all that sort of stuff. And, you can imagine the sort of marketing types that get hold of something in the 1990s and 2000s compared to the sort of hippie, psychedelic thing of the 60s. But it wasn't just that he survived. It's not about longevity. John Peel was ahead of the curve for every single music movement in the UK. I mean, a lot of it did come over from the US, but he was the first up riding the curve before anyone else here knew it. So in the 60s, he was playing the really sort of psychedelic stuff that other DJs weren't sort of really touching. In the 70s, he was very influential on the early careers of Mark Bolan and T-Rex and David Bowie. Bowie himself, before he died, paid a huge, thank you to what he owed John Peel. Then Peel basically played punk before anybody else would. And then after punk in the 70s, we had lots of, sort of fragmentation. All through this, he would play his own diet of reggae, blues, country, and then just strange music. Like there's a band, I don't know if you call them a band. They were called the Finland Shouting Choir, and that's exactly what they were. Apparently, they were a choir of people from Finland who shouted. So he'd play lots of very, very strange and eclectic music back to back, and he built up a huge devoted following. And the older he got, but bear in mind he was DJing until he was about 67 or something like that. He kept bringing in the young audience that the rest of the BBC radio, they just could never find. They were always trying to make their audience younger and bring in the next generations. And Peel did. Now, admittedly, not in huge numbers for the mainstream, because what he did was very much not in the mainstream. But he was extraordinarily successful in forging the music culture and tastes of this country. So he played all the rave stuff, he played a lot of dance stuff. Now, I can't stand dance music, but, without without his support. He was an interesting character in himself, and what this book does very well is it plots Peel's own changes, including his voice, his accent, from 1967 to 2005, and what he represented. His own history, he's from a middle-class, successful family in Liverpool, and as a sort of rite of passage, he was sent to America to go and sell insurance there. But he found himself sort of hanging out more and more at radio stations, because the one thing he loved was music. And he managed to get some DJing spots at parties on radio stations in Dallas, so that when he came back from America, he had that CV and he had a ton of records that no one else in Britain had access to. And it just happened to coincide with the growth in pirate radio in the UK, whereby, in order to get around the restrictive broadcasting laws, ships would moor outside of British territorial waters and broadcast back into Britain. So Peel joined Radio London, which meant that 2 weeks in every 3 he was living on board a ship. So that was his formative years. The pirate ship era was closed down by legislation, but it just happened to coincide at the time when BBC Radio 1 was being set up. So Radio sort of 3 was classical, Radio 4 was talk and news and current affairs. Radio 2 was sort of light entertainment, easy listening. Radio 1 was supposed to be the youthful, slightly more noisy thing, and Peel joined it, and he started off, as I say, with the psychedelic stuff. And, you know, as I say, this soundtracks my life, because not only is it about the music, a lot of which I remember. I probably listened to Peel in sort of about 81 on to about, I don't know exactly when, but probably about 88, 89, when I actually got a job in a record shop from that point in, and I stopped listening to him because I was hearing the music early myself, as we got the pre-releases in the record shop. Sort of a bit like a busman's holiday, to then go home after 8 hours in a record shop to then go and sort of listen to more music. The great man came into our shop a few times, and I remember one of my colleagues, his wife was overdue for her pregnancy, and my colleague asked Peel to play her something to induce pregnancy, and he played some death metal grindcore by Napalm Death, I think, and that was his sort of sense of humour. The book is not a hagiography. You know, it does trace, you know, problems that Peel's own position had. So I'm just going to read one quick example of that. The dictionary of the John Peel Show will have to be rewritten in the light of gangster rap, as Peel tries to juggle these double standards. To be paternal without being hypocritical, while all the time pushing the limits of radio. But for the moment, Rape Man, which is the name of a band, can't say butt crack in their song, and the Booyard Tribe can say whatever they like in their gangster rap. So there was a lot of sort of, you know, compromise and thinking about, you know, the increase of political correctness and things like that, which Peel only ever really had a half-hearted attitude towards. He just wanted to play the music he liked. He was on the left politically, so he did have a grasp and an understanding of these things. But ultimately, I think he sort of veered towards the sort of artist free expression side. But there were blind spots in him. I think the thing that's really important about John Peel, and I think this applies to literature in the UK today, is how regional he was. In that, when punk rock broke, Peel facilitated it spreading to the suburbs. He was playing these records that you couldn't hear anywhere else, because half of them hadn't even been committed to vinyl yet, because no one had a record deal. But when punks realised that they could, you know, very cheaply sort of get a 300 pressing run of a 7-inch single, they would send it to Peel and he would play it, obviously, and that would give them more exposure. And gradually all the big punk bands got signed to major labels. But what it enabled, what it facilitated, was bands in any sort of small town outside of London would send their demo tapes into John Peel to play. And with his support, you know, gradually they were empowered to go and, you know, to actually make a go of it, try and make a career of it. And Peel would take a Radio 1 roadshow into these places where he would DJ for the night. There might be some live bands as well, or it might just be him playing records and stuff. And it's incredibly important, how John Peel facilitated the non-London centric approach to music. And I think literature, could take some lessons somehow. I don't know what the equivalent of a BBC One radio DJ is in the literature world, but you need some sort of curator to help. We have a lot of fantastic independent record labels, independent publishers, in cities. So there's Dead Ink in Liverpool, there's Comma Press in Manchester, there was Tyndall Press in Birmingham, although I think they've now gone. There's one in Sheffield, who, apologies, I can't remember your name. There's Splice in Birmingham. There's Gallybeggars Press in Norwich. So all of these cities outside of London have vibrant but small independent publishing houses. And somehow, if we could bottle what Peel did for sort of punk and spread it to the provinces and bring that to the publishing world, we'd all be a lot better off, I think. The other thing this book does is that it basically each year gets its own sort of treatment, and it includes a running list, a playlist of what Peel played that night, but also there'll be a little snippet of a news story, nothing to do with John Peel, what's happening in the country. And I remember so many of those, but they weren't on top of my head because they're no longer relevant. And there are so many sort of names of MPs, members of Parliament, who no one remembers anymore, but actually affected our lives, with their sort of terrible legislative, or political initiatives. And, I say, I lived this book. When I first discovered John Peel, and I can't remember how I was clued into it, but, I did that absolute classic John Peel stereotype. I listened on a little transistor radio, no smaller than that, battery, while I was supposed to be asleep, because he came on between 10 and 12, and I'm a 14-year-old boy or whatever I am. And, you'd listen out for a noise on the stairs, and then, you turn the volume right down so that you weren't discovered. I mean, that is a standard British, stereotype of British males from that era. We did grow up with this, and so much. I'm not a nostalgic person. I very, very rarely look back, but this book brought a lot of stuff back for me, not particularly in a warm, fuzzy way, but unfortunately, John Peel died at 67. I think we lost a national treasure. Music has never been the same, but that's also the influence of people like Simon Cowell. And I think Britain is the poorer for it. I mean, he couldn't have gone on forever. So this is a fabulous book, but I admit possibly of limited interest. I mean, Peel did stretch outside the UK. He did a regular broadcast on British Armed Forces Radio, a monthly broadcast. Obviously, the age of the internet, which he welcomed, spread his message far and wide and got people, in live broadcast, because most of his broadcasting was live, would email him and sort of, praise a record or make a request or slate a record, Of course, if you slated a record to John Peel that he'd just played, that would make him play it five more times. But he was also a sort of endearing character, no matter how many years in the business, he was inept. He would put records on at the wrong speed, or there'd be dead air because he'd screwed something up on the mixing table. He in his latter years, he was very much a family man. He had 4 kids and stayed married to his wife. Although I don't know how faithful he was pre-marriage, but anyway, because I've seen a picture of him with Jermaine Greer. Apparently they had an affair. He was very much a family man, and he had a BBC radio show called Home Truths, which has nothing to do with music. It was all about sort of observations of family life. And his long-time producer of his music show, called John Walters, begged him not to do it. Said, this is trashing your image, John. But Peel went ahead and carried on doing it, and became in a way more popular for that than his 40-odd years of broadcasting. This quite esoteric, abstruse, marginalised music. So I love this book. It's a 5-star read for me, without any shadow of a doubt. As I say, it won't be of interest to lots of people, but then that's true of any non-fiction. So there you have it. Dark Eden by Chris Beckett. And I'm not going to read the title again, but a book on John Peel's broadcasting career by David Cavanagh. Okay, thanks very much. Till next time.